Now that I've talked about the circumstances internal to the society in the years immediately before the suppression, let me mention some of the external circumstances, cultural, political, religious, at the time antecedent to the suppression, that affected the life of the society. I'll mention what they are first very briefly, just list them, and then I'll go back over each one of them and say a few words. I want to remind you, though, that as Samuel Johnson, the great English writer, said at one point, "I now rise here to the grandeur of generalizations." So please keep that in mind. Those circumstances are, number one, the Enlightenment; number two, nationalism; number three, Jansenism; number four, the decline of the papacy; number five, the pressures from opposite points of a spectrum from the philosophes and the regalists; and number six, anti-clericalism. So let's start there with the Enlightenment. Basically, the Enlightenment, you could say, begins about the middle of the 17th century. Let's say from 1640 or 50 on, symbolized in philosophy by Descartes, cogito ergo sum, famous remark that he made, and in the natural sciences, physics especially, by Newton. Remember, however, that the natural sciences and what we call physics today was regarded as part of philosophy. It was natural philosophy. The original title of Newton's great work was Philosophiae Naturalis, was Principia Mathematica Philosophiae Naturalis, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. And much of the Enlightenment was an attempt to put together around the world a rationalized order by which you could understand the whole of the world, philosophical, psychological, physical, and maybe religious, so they thought. It was, the Enlightenment, an inchoate grasping for a new mathematicized, operable worldview. And that worldview was about to be brought about by reason operating on nature. The two great words of the Enlightenment, man's reason, used unfetteredly by itself on the world around us, nature itself. It was not necessarily, the Enlightenment was not necessarily hostile to religion at all at the beginning. It was symbolized rather best by Kant, Immanuel Kant's phrase, the Enlightenment was man's liberation from his self-imposed tutelage. He had let others, other than man himself, teach himself how he was to think, what he was to say, how he was to regard himself in the world. Now, by use of his own reason, he was to understand himself and the world. Or again, as Kant said, aude sapere, dare to think, dare to reason, dare to understand. The major examples, of course, even before the Enlightenment began, of that kind of thing was, the major example was Galileo, with the overturning of an Aristotelian physics in which the earth was the center of the universe and the sun moved around it, to the change in which the sun was the center of the universe and the earth, only one of a whole vast number of planets, moved around that. But that was insane, absolutely insane, and you know that yourself. It's not true, you know that, don't you, that the world moves around the sun. Every day you can walk out of your room anywhere and you can see the sun move around the earth, can't you? Don't you see that by your own natural experience? Didn't the greatest of physicists for centuries upon century, and Aristotle leading them, teach that rather that the earth was the center of the universe and the sun moved around it? And most importantly, did not Scripture itself say the same thing? Joshua held his arms up, and the sun did not move from its tracks, and the moon stood in its place. How could you dispute Scripture? I'm not going to go into the whole Galileo case, but in some senses it symbolized the whole difficulty and problems, whole series of difficulties and problems that were to be raised by the Enlightenment. It was seriously intellectual at first. By the middle of the 18th century, it had become highly popularized and vulgarized in examples, for example, the little French book, Newtonisme pour les dames, Newtonian physics for the ladies.
Yeah.
All of nature and reason were going to come up against certain circumstances with which people of the time lived. Reason was to be supreme. What about God's revelation, embodied in the teachings of the church? Nature was to be supreme when we all knew from the teachings of the church that the supernatural was infinitely beyond it, and though we might not be able to understand it by the use of our own unaided reason, it just shows how weak reason was. We could understand it by the teachings, indeed the dogmatic teachings of the church. Among a difficulty with the Enlightenment as it grew was that people were asking questions to which the church gave answers that didn't really touch the questions. And when that happens, you begin to get a disjunction between the world as people saw it and understood it and what they were being told or taught that that world was like. Among the few organized attempts to deal with the Enlightenment on its own terms and live in that contemporary world was the Society of Jesus, with its great school in Rome, the Roman College, later be known as the Gregorian University, which before the advent of the royal societies in England and France and so on, was probably the single greatest scientific institution in the entire world. With the condemnation of Galileo, it wasn't that what the people there were teaching or were being censored. It was that the Jesuits self-censored themselves there. Some of them well knew that Galileo, at least theoretically, and the way he talked was right. But what were they going to do with that in the light of the condemnation of Galileo and his views? That's one of the problems that increasingly the Enlightenment dealt with in an increasingly hostile way as it saw what it judged to be the intransigence of the church. Secondly, nationalism. That is to say, the growth of the nation state in the 17th century and the 18th was best symbolized by the 30 Years' War that started in 1618 as a religious war pitting Catholics against Protestants and ended up 30 years later, after immense destruction, especially across Germany, it ended up as a political war with a political solution that didn't take account at all, really, of the absolutely vigorously proposed religious concerns. A symbol of that was that the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War was denounced by John Milton, the great English Protestant poet, as absolutely wrong because it treated the Catholics too well and did not take account of the truth of the gospel as was taught by the Protestant churches. And on the other hand, Peace of Westphalia was denounced by the then Pope at the time as absolutely null, void, without any effect at all, because it didn't take account of the Catholic concerns and was too favorable to the Protestants. What came out of the war was the nation-states in Europe, France especially, which became the most powerful there, and then the smaller states in the Holy Roman Empire, each saw its own power as the primary thing that was to be dealt with in statecraft, and that the idea of a united Christendom, indeed made up of different states, but all united around a civilization that was imbued with the gospel, was increasingly dead and gone. But the only great external force against this increasing nationalism was that international church itself. And what was one of the organizations most at the service of that international church? itself an international organization, the Society of Jesus, with members all over the world that owed allegiance not first and foremost to the national state, but to the church which they served, and increasingly in the minds of some of its opponents, to the Society of Jesus, which was an organization superseding all of the national interests and going its own way, often enough supposedly hostile to the national state. Thirdly, Jansenism, named after a bishop in Belgium, the Bishop of Ypres, Y-P-R-E-S. During the First World War, the British soldiers pronounced that wipers. The Bishop of Wipers, who was a great expert on Augustine. Basically, as people always said, the great teacher of grace. What God's grace meant in Christian revelation was, of course, St. Paul. Cornelius Jansen maintained that the great interpreter of St. Paul was St. Augustine. And Jansen was convinced that the great interpreter and teacher of what Augustine meant was himself, Cornelius Jansen, in his great book Augustinus, which dealt fundamentally with the relationship between the sovereignty of God and the freedom of the will. A very serious question in theology, which was not solved then, and certainly has not been solved in our own day. But increasingly, Jansen's, in his understanding of those relationships, came down very strongly on the sovereignty of God, and so much so the sovereignty of God that one had to question not the existence of free will in man, but certainly the great debility of that free will. On the other side of that, the Jesuits, right from the beginning, with the conviction that God operates upon the human being, but that the human being has to make decisions. The whole spiritual exercises is about the ability and the desirability of a human being to make free decisions. The Jesuits came down very strongly on the side in that mystery of free will. We will never understand completely God's nature and the mystery of God's sovereignty, but we can understand much more easily what free will is about and how man has to make decisions within his life in accord with the circumstances in which he lived, not in accord with a certain number of rigid rules that are absolutely applicable in every and all circumstances. And therefore the Jesuits got a reputation for a casuistry, applying the circumstances of real life to questions of morality and to how you solve them practically in accord with the principles of the faith, but also the experiences of the human beings involved. That went down very hard with people who were concerned about and convinced that the human person after the fall of Adam was not essentially harmed, Luther would say that, but rather he was certainly wounded in his nature. Luther would have said, as indeed he did say, man was utterly vitiated in his nature. He could do no good by himself. Certainly the Jesuit position was man could do good. Indeed, he needed the grace of God to be saved, but that he was capable of real free will. And in some ways, the flashpoint of that kind of a concern was not long theological speculation, but rather, what do you do about so simple and yet so central a practice and a doctrine in the Church as the Eucharist and the reception of communion? The Council of Trent, after all, had said that every person was obliged to receive communion once a year. How often do you think most people in the 17th century went to communion? Or in the 18th century? Or in the 19th century? Well, if you went once a year, you fulfilled the obligations of a good Christian. If you went once a month, you were a very good Christian. If you went once a week, you certainly had to have the okay of your confessor, because you were skirting very dangerously close to irreverence toward the sacrament. going once a day, well, you just didn't go once a day. How often did Jesuits go to communion? And not the priests who would celebrate when they did ideally every day. How often did they go to communion the 16th or 17th or 18th or 19th or beginning of the 20th century? Scholastics and brothers went to communion regularly once a week. Surprised? They could also go on what were known in the society as communion days. That is, great feast days, holy days of obligation, and great feast days in the society of Jesus itself. But there was a great question for a long time in the society: could Jesuit scholastics go to communion 2 days in a row if there was a Sunday, for example, and a feast day of the society the next day? Could they even, worse yet, or more dubious, could they go to communion 3 days in a row? Suppose you had a feast of the society on one day, a Sunday, and then you had a holy day of obligation the next day. Weren't you exposing the sacrament to irreverence by doing so? I'm just bringing up this example to show how very different our world is at the present time from that. But the Jesuits were regarded as laxists for allowing people or regularly encouraging people to go to communion once a week. The very first book published by a member of the society after he had joined the society was by Cristobal de Madrid, one of the companions of Ignatius in Rome, on frequent communion. And he certainly didn't mean daily communion by that. But for the Jansenists and the rigorists, I guess the best way of expressing their view was, you worm, if you are a fallen person, if you are inclined toward evil, as Scripture regularly says, if you never know whether you could possibly be worthy of receiving God Himself in communion, you worm, how dare you go to communion frequently? And that was a position that was held for a long, long time. That whole question, which agitated the church for a long, long time, was finally solved by Pope Pius X in the beginning of the 20th century, when he cut the Gordian knot of that whole question and said, communion is not there as a reward for virtue. Communion is there as a help toward virtue. Of course, none of us are fundamentally worthy of receiving communion. That's not why God comes to us there. It's because He loves us. What the Jesuits had been teaching. But to do that, they had to be able to understand the circumstances in which people went to confession. And the Jesuits very early received the reputation for being laxists in confession. The Jansenists were rigorists in dogmatic theology and rigorists in moral theology. The Jesuits, in their mind, were laxists and exposing the church and the sacraments to a sacrilege and a relaxation of what it really meant to be a Christian. That was the religious side of it. But there was a political side to Jansenism too, especially, not only, but especially in France, where members increasingly of the Parlement of Paris, not Parliament which passes laws, as in the English example, but the Parlement of the 17th and 18th century French example, which was a body of lawyers that had acted like a court and had the legal right to register the edicts of the king. They were often enough at least semi-anti-monarchist. They were very fiercely pro-French nation and French church. They were Gallican in their religious sentiments in that they felt the French church had special privileges which even the Holy See could not touch. But after all, here was the Society of Jesus, again, an international organization supporting the Holy See and the Vatican. So what started off as a religious quarrel also became a political quarrel in which the parliaments were pitted against the Jesuits, increasingly in a bitter fight by both the Jansenist theologians and the Jansenist parliamentarians. Fourthly, there was, in a sense, in the 18th century, a decline of the influence and power of the church and the papacy. Suppose you have been ill, not death-threatening, but a very, very bad case of the flu, let's say, or maybe even a death-threatening illness. You're now on the way to recovery. There's no question you're recovering and you don't have the illness any longer. Doesn't it take you a long time to come through that recovery? Aren't you in some ways exhausted at the end or during that recovery and after fighting the illness? In so many ways, the church was that way for some time after it had come through the near-mortal illness of the Protestant Reformation. It had recovered in what sometimes, I think, with Father O'Malley, John O'Malley, is incorrectly called the Counter-Reformation, but it had recovered in the vigor of the ongoing Catholic Reformation. But it was exhausted in a lot of ways after that particular recovery. It didn't realize how exhausted it was and how it was going to come up against another great, great challenge, as it certainly did with the Enlightenment, with Jansenism, with the rise of the national state. It was too well self-satisfied after that recovery. Let me give you an example of what I mean there. Have any of you ever been up on the Pincio Hill in Rome, looked down over that beautiful city, the whole, expanse of it? Okay. Have any of you ever been in the Piazza Navona in Rome? One of the supreme examples of urban architecture, it seems to me, in the whole world. Some of you have seen, maybe if you haven't been there, illustrations of that piazza, a long oblong with these glorious Renaissance and Baroque buildings on all of the long sides and the short axis of it also. The great fountain of the rivers right in the middle of it. Some of the greatest work of Borromini and Bernini, the great artists of the Baroque there, in the golden glow of a late autumn Roman afternoon, with the sun shining on the glorious buildings there, in the burnt umber and the orange of their colors, with the fountains plashing away and the sun shining and the sparkling of the water there, with the exultant angels and saints in the Baroque sculptures on the facades of the churches and in the fountains, with the brilliant autumn leaves whispering in the wind, with such enchantment in that square. I know I've been there at times. You want to say, it's so lovely. Stay, stay. Don't let it ever change. And in some ways, the church in the recovery after the Reformation, in the full afterglow of the Baroque, was feeling that way. But if you're in the Piazza Navona at such a circumstance, on such a late autumn afternoon, if you're observant, you'll also later see that the basins of that great fountain of the river has been somewhat cracked with age. And the leaves, the golden and red leaves of autumn, are indeed golden and red, but they are also starting to change to brown, and they're beginning to fall. The angels and the saints, often enough, that look like marble are plaster, and they're crumbling. The walls of some of the buildings are scaling away. The breeze that's so beautiful there, had been warm an hour before, is beginning to turn chill, because after all, it is late afternoon, and it is late autumn, and the sun is going down, and the night is coming, and winter is soon to come. That's the way the church was in these years before the suppression of the Society of Jesus. Not because the society was involved with that symbolism or that color, but I think it's important that that's in so many ways it's a vivid expression of how the church was without realizing that that winter was coming, and it was going to be a long, hard, cold winter of the French Revolution, only 16 years after the suppression of the society. From the end of the 30 Years' War, the papacy was increasingly impotent as it attempted to play as a state, a political state, when it was really only a minor Italian principality in the political arena with the big boys, with the increasingly powerful large nation states jealous of their own sovereignty. Next, the philosophes and the regalists. And by the philosophes, I mean the people like Diderot, D'Alembert, Voltaire, who increasingly were impatient with the church, increasingly anti-clerical, increasingly read, increasingly popular, and who were increasingly impatient that the church itself, to their minds, seemed so utterly retrograde when in the face of the use of reason operating upon nature. After all, versus reason was dogmatism, and versus nature was supernature and indeed superstition. In addition to that, you had the regalists, that is to say, the lawyers in the royal courts, stressing the divine right of kings in all matters save dogma. And divine right of kings included the right to run the church the way they thought it ought to be run in their own countries without interference from the papacy. They were reformers of politics, economics, and the social order. And it's true in some senses that while the church was the upholder of tradition and sane traditions that had been handed down through the history of the church, often enough traditions were mixed up with superstitions that were held at least as tenaciously, and with outmoded positions that were supposedly religious positions but simply could be held no longer. For example, did you know that Mary Magdalene, Joseph of Arimathea, Lazarus, and Martha were the founders of the church in France? Just like supposedly Saint James was the founder of the church in Spain. Don't show this video to any Spaniards. Saint Andrew, the founder of the church in Constantinople. Saint Peter and Paul in Rome. It was very important for the church in a variety of countries to have an apostolic foundation. What did France have? Well, they had the legend that Pontius Pilate had pushed the four of them off in a leaky boat from the shore of Palestine, hoping and intending that the boat would drown, but that with the power of the Holy Spirit, they were wafted across the Mediterranean to land at Marseille in France, to go up into the valley of the Dordogne, into the valley of the Tarn River, sort of a miniature Grand Canyon, and to dig caves there and live out the rest of their lives in contemplation. That was held as an immemorial tradition in parts of the French church. Or did you know, for example, the Bollandists, that's the group of Jesuit scholars in Belgium who were attempting to do scholarly scientific investigations of the lives of the saints, almost had one of their volumes put on the index because they suggested that maybe the Carmelite order was not the oldest order in the church, because probably, despite what the Carmelites said, probably the Carmelites were not founded in the Old Testament by the prophet Isaiah on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, because that was almost put on the index because it was scandalous, injurious to the faith, deleterious to the tradition and the well-merited glories of the Carmelite order, etc., etc. It was easy enough in those kind of circumstances for the philosophes to heap ridicule upon the church, and they could write clever remarks and clever books while basically they were answered in long, weighty terms. Any of you who has seen Candide, or even more has read that wonderful novel by Voltaire, recognize what an effective means it was to pillory what he regarded as the superstition, obscurantism, and dogmatism of the church. And then finally you had anti-clericalism, a phenomenon that usually exists only when the possible uses and privileges and practices of the clergy become excessive in the circumstances in which the clergy lives. Remember that up until this time and until the French Revolution, the three fundamentally, deeply psychologically resonant circumstances of the human person were controlled by the church: hatching, batching and dispatching. In other words, birth, when you were introduced into the society of Christendom by baptism, without baptism and the registration of that baptism in the parish church, you were not only not a Christian, you weren't a citizen. Matching, you could not be married except in a religious ceremony. And dispatching, which in some ways is the most deeply emotional thing, unless you were buried as a Christian, died as a Christian, you were not buried in consecrated ground. And that didn't mean you'd go into a non-sectarian cemetery. They'd make accommodations perhaps, but effectively, you supposedly were going to be buried on a dung heap. And if you were not in good odor with the church at death, what would you expect not only in this life, such as that, but in the afterlife, simply hell and damnation? You can see how all of these circumstances, external to the society itself, impinged upon the society. Also, as far as anti-clericalism goes, the power and privileges of the upper clergy were extraordinarily excessive in relationship to the lower clergy, the clergy that basically dealt day by day with the ordinary people. Again, an example taken from France, which I happen to know fairly well. The average income of an average parish priest in France in, let's say, the middle of the 18th century would be, they would use the word livre, L-I-V-R-E-S, pounds, 20 pounds a year. The income of the Archbishop of Strasbourg for the previous 2 generations, in which the archdiocese was ruled by the Rohan family, two or three successive cardinals de Rohan, the average income of the archbishop every year was 2 million gold livres. You can imagine the disparity there. And not only the income of the upper clergy, but the privileges of the upper clergy were such that they grated upon, not only they grated upon the nobility, but they also grated upon the rising middle class. In addition to that, the church had the ownership of immense parts of the landed property in most of the countries of Europe. They had accumulated that out of donations and gifts and purchase over the centuries to fund the works of the church, to build the churches, to support the parishes, the hospitals, the orphanages, the schools, the leper asylums. After all, there was no Peter's Pence, there was no development program, there was no church collection every Sunday, there was no bingo. It was landed property and the income that supported the church. But increasingly over the centuries, a very large proportion of property was owned by the church, and often enough by prelates who had been appointed not for their service to the church, but because they were friends of the king and were promoted to bishoprics under those kinds of circumstances, which caused only increasingly the biting wit of the anti-clericals. Those were some of the circumstances, put very briefly, that were external to the society of Jesus, but which impinged upon the society as a very visible entity, international in scope, important within their own countries because of the educational establishments that they had and their publications and their being confessors of the kings. The difficulties that people had with the church were heaped upon the society as a very visible representative in the service of that international church.